Good morning, everyone, and welcome to SCIO. I am Fran, Moisa, a headhunter and talent advisor broadcasting from lovely Malta. But today I won't be speaking with you about recruitment. I'll be wearing my broadcaster and panelist hat. And if you have been working in a regulated industry, aside from having to deal with a pandemic, you've also have to deal with introduction of new legislation and changes, all whilst being in a remote environment. So if it can become a bit heavy. So what I've decided to do today is to have with me Charles Cassor, who is the founder of Shoulder Compliance. Shoulder Compliance is an anti-financial crime consultancy focused on AML, CFT sanctions, and anti-market abuse. Prior to founding Shoulder Compliance, Charles has had a illustrious career in legal and compliance. He has worked as a legal advisor in Malta and London for a variety of clients. Also, he acted as the head of legal and compliance for a large fintech institution with an international presence, and most recently as the head of group compliance for a credit institution in Malta and Belgium. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce you to Charles Cassor. Charles, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Good morning, Fran. The pleasure is all mine, truly.
Fantastic. How are you doing this morning, Charles? All good?
Very well. Still working
Ready?
from our home office, and it's the new normal now. So we can't say we're surprised anymore to wake up to another day of working from home. But it's very encouraging signs here at Shoulder Compliance. So we're very happy to be with you, Fran, to have this chat about compliance matters this morning.
Thank you. Thank you, Charles. And Charles, could you shed some light for us on the latest changes and introductions, developments into the regulatory and compliance space? Because there's been quite a few, let's say quite a few challenging ones.
Yes, it's been, look, I would say the past 18 to 24 months have all been very fast moving in terms of the AML CFT and let's say the anti-financial crime world here in Malta. But it all seems to be coming to a head more or less right about now, with the last 4 to 6 weeks having been particularly fast moving. And we're seeing new legislative developments take place at a fairly rapid pace. And I would say there are probably 3 or 4 key developments which we've seen over the last 4 to 8 weeks, which I think are very much worthwhile highlighting. Number one, something which we have been saying and which we continue to see is very, very increased levels of activity on the part of regulators in general. So the SCIO and the MFSA have become increasingly activist. We're seeing very, very large numbers of inspections actually take place across the board. Here at Shoulder Compliance, we see this firsthand because we actually participate in the delivery of some of these exercises, because we are one of a, I believe, relatively small number of private sector entities that actually collaborate with the regulators in the delivery of some of these exercises. So we're seeing a lot more activity there, obviously looming large on the horizon, and surely part of the discussion here is the possibility of a grey listing for Malta as a result of the Moneyval exercises. Everyone hopes that we will avoid that, and I think the regulators have been committing huge efforts towards avoiding the grey listing, which would obviously be detrimental for Malta. We're not yet out of the woods. We'll still need to see. I believe we're meant to have a re-evaluation roundabout in July, but there has been some extension to that as a result of all of the COVID-related developments. So there's been a lot of activity over there, but of course it's a very complex machine, right? A countrywide anti-financial crime framework is a complex machine, and every part of that machine needs to work properly in order for the machine as a whole to function. And there's still probably some way to go. So that's number one. General levels of regulatory activism continue to be very high. More specifically, we've seen one particular regulator, which is the Sanctions Monitoring Board, becoming a lot more visible in the recent past, and I think this is a positive thing. When elsewhere we read about big regulatory actions, they're often about sanctions-related matters, and I think it's good and positive that Malta catches up. Again, at shoulder compliance, we see this firsthand in many of the exercises which FIU are performing. They're actually taking on a delegated role from the Sanctions Monitoring Board and performing sanctions-related exercises as part of their site visits, for example. So one message to all subject persons who may be following this broadcast are, don't ignore your sanctions compliance, don't ignore your sanctions training, your sanctions policies, your sanctions screening tools. It's as important a part of your AML, CFT, and anti-financial crime framework as any other. So I want to really call out the fact that we're seeing increasing activity on the part of the SMB. Next, we've had some fairly interesting and important regulatory developments which have been taking place. A couple of weeks ago, the FIU announced the issuance of a new legal notice introducing certain amendments to the PML-FTR. And I think these are things which every subject person, and in particular every MLRO, needs to be aware of. So first of all, we've seen the shortening of timeframes, or what appears to be the shortening of timeframes for the reporting of suspicious transactions to the FIU. I think in the past, legislation used to specify a time period of 5 working days. Now the language has changed. We're no longer speaking of a time period calculated, measured in terms of days, but rather we're seeing the use of the language of promptly. So the FIU now says that when you have a suspicion, you need to promptly notify them via an STR. Now, what promptly means is still a bit vague, right? Promptly is quite a wonderful word, and it's not a very precise measurement, right? But I think it's a fair interpretation that promptly means something quicker than 5 days. And knowing sort of some of the discussions that have been surrounding these amendments, I suspect that, especially for matters relating to terrorist finance, right? Because obviously we're always speaking of money laundering on the one side and yes, financing of terrorism on the other side, and they're not exactly the same thing, right? And I think especially in the context of funding of terrorism, subject person should be prepared that if there is a suspicion of funding of terrorism, the approach should be you pretty much drop everything, you go straight to the FIU, and you report within the day itself. Now, the FIU has indicated that they're going to issue further guidance on what this term promptly means and sort of how to implement that into your procedures. So let's wait and see. But I think subject persons would be very well advised to expect a shortening of the expected timeframes. Next, we have what is probably the big one, right? So the big one is the very, very clear introduction of what is effectively a senior management responsibility regime in the context of AML CFT. So there has been the introduction of very clear language in the PML-FTR, which permits the imposition of administrative fines on senior management personnel. So that includes not just members of the board, right, but also people who sit on the C-suite, for example, and also includes very specifically the MLRO, right? So if there are actions or omissions which in a grossly negligent or in an intentional way have led to or contributed to failures in your AML CFT program, you can expect potential fines, which can be relatively dramatic for fines levied on individuals. Up to 250,000 euro is the maximum amount that is contemplated in the legislation. So the fines can theoretically be quite draconian. Obviously, it's still early days, so we need to see how these things actually pan out in practice, what the tolerances, what the thresholds effectively implemented by the FIU are. But it is a new reality which everyone needs to face up to.
Needs to be aware. And on the note of that, Charles, if I may ask a question to it, perhaps you could clarify for us, especially in the context of the MLRO and board responsibility. So failure to comply with regulations, failure to notify any suspicious activities, and so on and so forth, can lead to, and correct me if I understood wrongly, to personal liability for the MLRO and the board. Okay. So
correct. We can actually,
change.
The specific language used by the rules is the following. So the new legal notice says it refers to anyone who through act or omission, whether in or due to gross negligence, lack oversight, subordinates, caused or contributed to the commission of any such contravention. So there are some things in that legislation which are actually broadening the power of that formulation, and there are some which are narrowing it down. I think most importantly is this reference to whether intentional or due to gross negligence. So that suggests that we're not looking at marginal matters or a missing document here and there.
Or human error cases.
I think if there are systemic issues, however, right, or if there are indications of laxness or laissez-faire in terms of how the procedures are deployed, then the formulation of the rules is robust enough to permit personal liability in a number of scenarios. So I think every MLRO in particular, but not only MLROs, every senior person within any organization should be taking a good look at their compliance programs to make sure that they are robust, because the message here is very clear that you may very well be held to account on a personal level. So this is the new reality which subject persons need to get to grips with sooner rather than later.
Absolutely. Thank you for clarifying that, Charles. And before we went live, we briefly touched upon the new legal notice introduced yesterday from the Molsa Business Registry Bureau. If you could, again, I know it's very new; it was just launched yesterday, but it would be great to hear, your thoughts on the matter.
As we say, we're not making things up when we're saying that things are very fast moving, because all of these new rules that we're talking about have been issued within the last 4 to 6 weeks. So very, very rapid pace of regulatory development. What we have seen is yesterday there was an announcement with respect to a new legal notice which significantly enhances the powers of the Malta Business Registry in connection with the maintenance of beneficial ownership registers. And I think probably the most dramatic and interesting development is the fact that the MBR is being empowered to perform site visits and to actually perform inspections in the way that the FIU would perform such inspections, targetedly in order to assess whether beneficial ownership information is being provided in the appropriate way. There's a bunch of other powers which they have been clearly allocated by means of this new legal notice. So there's new procedures which have to be followed on an annual basis. You need to refresh beneficial ownership information. Beneficial ownership information needs to be supported and evidenced by means of certified documents, which is somewhat frustrating as a development, because on the one hand, we've had a very big and very welcome, in my opinion, push on the part of the FIAU to permit and to be more open to remote business type operations and to permit more reliance on soft copies. But now we have the MBR, which seems to be going in the opposite direction. We'll have to see how that pans out, but it's clearly a signal that there's slightly different messages which are coming through there. And the MBR has also been empowered to take certain punitive actions if deemed necessary in connection with the failure to provide appropriate beneficial ownership information, and that includes refusing to accept the registration of a document, and also taking direct action against the company or its directors. So this is still relatively new. We have to come to grips with it, but I would advise any not just any subject person, because these things are broader than subject persons in terms of the FIU, right? So anyone who is dealing with the MBR should really have a good look at the latest rules and let's say take some time to digest the increased powers that the MBR now has in order to enforce the appropriate adherence to the beneficial ownership rules. It's all very new. I was reading about this yesterday and this morning. It's really fast moving.
And you've mentioned that they are kind of more or less with immediate effect to some extent. There isn't necessarily a cool down period.
The new forms need to start being used as of July of this year. Okay, so we need to be quick to catch up.
A week and a half, so more or less until July. So
exciting
it's good
times.
Yes, it's good to read up on it for our audience to remind them. And I would also like to remind our audience that any questions you may have for Charles, hopefully not for me because I'm not a compliance expert, you can type them in the comment section either on Facebook or YouTube, depending on the platform that you are watching us now. And so new wave of regulatory changes, increased responsibility, increased power of action for certain regulatory, legislative or registration bodies in Malta. With all of this, how can businesses prepare themselves, especially for an increased activity in inspections?
Yes, I would say that one positive of the significantly increased level of regulatory activity that we are seeing is that you can start to form a pretty robust picture of what the regulators expect. So obviously with more activity, right, you get a bigger sample size to work with in terms of regulatory expectations. And I think if we look closely at these things, we can start to form a pretty clear, let's say, mental checklist of measures and preparations that we need to have in place. Now, there's no need to make any secret of this. I think everybody should be preparing properly. On our website, on shoulder.mt, we've actually published, I think, what is a very useful resource, which is your anti-financial crime compliance audit preparation checklist. So we've published quite an extensive document which pretty much aggregates the knowledge which we've gained from assisting and supporting various inspections and exercises across various industry groups to really provide a resource that helps people to prepare for these kinds of exercises. It would take quite a long time to go through every aspect of it, but the first thing I will say, and this is I think extremely important, is it is not only about your CDD documentation. I think we still have a culture in this country where people associate compliance with document collection, with identifying beneficial owners and having the appropriate paperwork. And don't get me wrong, that is extremely important. You do need to have the appropriate documentation in place. Otherwise, you're dead in the water, right? That is very fundamental to your program. But you can be penalized and you will be assessed on various other aspects of your program. So the FIU is very interested, and not only the FIU, right? Because as we're saying, it's not one regulator that we're talking about, but multiple regulators that are taking an interest in anti-financial crime. They're very interested, number one, in your governance. I think this is the big theme. So regulators are interested in making sure that you don't just have the appropriate documentation on your clients, but that you are also putting in place the appropriate decision-making organs, that the right information is reaching the appropriate people within the organization, you have the correct escalation paths, that you have the appropriate policies and procedures, that you have management information, and that you really have a good handle organizationally at the very top as to what is going on with your financial crime program. And of course, this has to be supported by appropriate documents, including very robust business risk assessment, including supporting methodology. So the regulators are not just interested in the CDD, right? They're also interested in other things. They're interested in the technology infrastructure that supports your program. Perhaps for smaller operations, this is not such an important element, but for a larger operation, a gaming company, a credit institution, a financial institution, a payments business, right? They're very interested in things such as how you are screening transactions, how you are monitoring and screening customer names at large scale, where the data sits, how is it processed, etc., etc. So my message here is you need to take a long, hard, holistic look at your program. Don't simply rely on having good customer documentation, because you will be assessed very broadly in terms of the robustness of that program.
It makes perfect sense. And one let's say it's not necessarily controversial, but it tends to generate a lot of discussion, especially in my role as a headhunter, is that most at a broader level, compliance is usually viewed as a cost. We both know the importance of proper governance and compliance within a business, and how it can enhance a business activity or not on the reverse side of things. And from my point of view, compliance is an investment that the business makes in order to ensure that they conduct themselves in an efficient, proper and fit manner as well. And any regulatory mishaps that can happen can seriously damage the reputation. So the cost of not being compliant, the cost of not being, fully conversant with the requirements, with the preparation necessary, especially on the inspection side of things, can cost a business dearly. And I'm sure that throughout your experience, you would have seen the effects of non-compliance and how detrimental it can be to a business's operation, which kind of leads me, which kind of led to a rise in the requirement of compliance, regulatory, and MLRO experts. And when this situation with COVID happened across the world, and we kind of moved to some extent remotely as well, that has been I think some of the people I've spoken with describe it as a new fresh level of hell to remain compliant in a remote scenario. And I think it's a reality that we need to get used to it. And I was wondering whether you'd be able to share some insights with us in how to remain consistent, how to remain compliant if you are still, or you will need to be again faced with a remote scenario.
I mean, I've had the let's say, the experience of having, let's say, seen the AML CFT world, I think probably from every possible angle in this jurisdiction, in the sense that I've been in business functions where effectively you're subject to the control of control functions, right, such as your AML team. So I have the experience of working to a P&L and trying to secure a deal, and then finding that there is a compliance objection of rightly so, of some sort. I've had the experience of leading compliance departments, so I've been on the other side of that fence, and now more recently I've had the experience of working hand in hand with regulators in terms of actually delivering the site visits and these kinds of supervisory exercises. So I've had the opportunity, I think, of looking at this from a 360 point of view. What I can say based on that experience is that yes, of course, delivering a compliance program remotely, right, presents new and different challenges, but it is by no means impossible. And I think I've actually seen across the board with many of my clients fairly good reactions to the new post-COVID world with an increased emphasis on remote business. I think number one, we need to highlight here that whether we are working from home or not, the underlying threats remain the same, and if anything, the threats might actually be increased. We're seeing some very credible literature come out from people such as the Interpol and the FATF, highlighting the fact that certain financial crime risk actually increase during times of generalized crisis, such as the one which we are still living through today. So I think that's important to bear in mind. It's not like the financial criminals go on holiday when there's a pandemic, right? They're still
Yes, indeed,
hard
indeed.
at work up to their nefarious deeds, and we need to be prepared for that. Second thing I want to highlight is that running a compliance function remotely is not too different to running any other part of your business remotely. So those same good fundamentals will serve you well in this context as well. So, the ability to communicate remotely, the ability to access your data remotely, the ability to have tools which are available remotely, all of that is very positive. I would say, however, the most important thing is to have a work ethic which is harmonious with a remote work environment. Especially senior management people, you actually probably need to spend a lot more time checking in with your various staff members and making sure that communication lines are clear and correct. Not because necessarily people laze off just because they're not in the office, right? I think many people will observe the phenomenon that when you're actually working from home, you probably spend more time working because all of your distinctions between work and non-work life suddenly disintegrate, right? So it's not necessarily the case that people commit less time and effort, but it simply takes more conscious effort to keep a team aligned in a remote environment. What I do want to highlight, and there's a lot of misunderstandings here, I feel, is that you can actually in Malta, in many circumstances, onboard and maintain customer relationships in a purely online remote environment. There's still in this country a lot of heavy reliance on physical documentation, right? And we know that the FIU has taken various steps to ensure that onboarding via soft copies and via, let's say, more technologically 2020 modern methods of dealing with customer onboarding processes is very much permitted under the FIU's more recent implementing procedures, and is perfectly capable of being deployed and has been deployed by various players in Malta with no objection on the part of regulators. Where you do need to be careful is that sometimes you can get overlapping requirements from different regulators, as we were mentioning just a few minutes ago with respect to the Malta Business Registry, where certain regulators may still expect physical documentation or certified documents in certain circumstances. So we do need to be a bit careful over there. But there are various circumstances in which a perfectly online-only remote type of onboarding process is permissible.
Yes, excellent. And I agree with that. Like you said, it's all about good governance, communication, and ensuring that the proper structure is put into place. And like you've mentioned slightly earlier, Charles, you've been, and you've had the opportunity to have a 360-degree view of the regulatory and compliance environment. What advice do you have for compliance, MLRO, regulatory legal professionals that are faced with this wave of changes, with this new way of working as well? What tips, or insights you can share with them to help them navigate through all of this more easily?
I think number one is professionalization, the first word I'd like to use over here. And by that, what I mean is that compliance should not be something which an organization or an individual does on the side. I think too many times we see MLRO positions, for example, being held by people who are clearly deeply invested in the business, not necessarily just on a commercial side, but on let's say an operational side. So if you spend from 8 a.m. till 8 p.m. every day dealing with the necessities of your business, right? You almost certainly do not have enough time, energy, and focus to dedicate to running a proper compliance function. And increasingly, you are going to be held personally responsible for that if you do not do it properly. So I think we're going to see, and my advice to subject persons would be to ensure that they have duly professionalized their AML and their general compliance functions. So what does that mean, professionalization? Make sure that you have people who are experts on board, right? People who have a certain level of experience on board. The compliance functions, I believe, inherently require a certain level of good judgment, a certain level of level-headedness, a certain level of seniority, which will typically come with experience and qualification. Although, of course, it also depends on personal strength of character. But sort of too many times we see compliance functions that are extensively staffed with very junior people. And of course, there is having junior people is very important and a healthy part of any well-balanced team, right? But too many times you see compliance functions that are, generally speaking, too junior, not empowered enough in order to be able to provide an appropriate check on the control on the business functions. So that is probably my first advice here. Make sure that you professionalize your AML functions. My second piece of advice is don't just professionalize, but also strengthen. To have one experienced person on the team, but see all the time and constantly drowning in all sorts of work, then obviously not going to be able to deliver properly. So you also need to strengthen. You need to strengthen in terms of personnel. I think there's no way of avoiding increasing compliance headcounts for foreseeable side around work within the recruitment industry. I'm sure you're seeing increasing demand for more compliance people and also more experienced compliance people in general. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, that is correct. There is a high demand of qualified compliance, MLRO, and regulatory professionals, and it is a challenge because of the demand still exceeds the supply in the market. It's the same case as it were. I think when we looked at it, Charles, I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago when we were at the university trying to, look at ways to increase
Indeed.
Yes, I think it was about 5 years that we went there, with Max Canada and Louis de Gabriele, and we were trying to get the industry on board to produce and to enhance the curriculum at university or course level that will equip professionals with the right academic understanding and exposure to be able to rise to the challenge. And one thing that I noticed, and you've touched upon it very well as well, is that the compliance MLRO function tends to get caught up in the day-to-day side of things. And when new legislation is being introduced, when regulatory changes do come into force, it can be slightly difficult for the professional that works in the compliance team to keep abreast of those challenges, because the compliance function, not across the board, but still in enough businesses to be slightly problematic, is very reactive rather than proactive. And especially with the increased level of activities that we've mentioned, the introduction of new legislation, if businesses can equip themselves to move into a more proactive state where they communicate with experts such as yourself or with their legal advisor or whoever they may be, to understand the changes that come into force and to prepare themselves in advance for them, rather than being faced with them like this at face value, and then you're thinking, oh, okay, we now have to do this, which makes the job of a compliance MLRO regulatory professional, 10 times harder when they are always in a reactive state.
Yes, I completely agree with that. I think it is a a very real risk. I think there are probably two ways in which compliance people can mitigate that risk. Number one, organizations, and this is something which compliance people should militate for if they don't have it. Organizations should ensure that compliance has a voice in the management of the organization. So compliance is not simply a back office function. I think we should be very far away from that approach nowadays. Compliance should be involved in the actual shaping of policy, the shaping of business decisions, and an integral part in business processes such as the launch of new products, the targeting of new jurisdictions, approaching new customer types. You need to integrate compliance into those decision-making processes. Otherwise, you will make mistakes which you will be held accountable for as a senior management team. So I think step one, in order to avoid unexpected surprises and nasty developments when it comes to compliance-related issues, is bring compliance on board early on and give compliance a strong voice in your organization. My second piece of advice is for compliance people. There's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of material. There's a lot of different people saying slightly different things, and you need to make sure that you are part of a community. So my advice to you is surround yourself with other people who understand the area, with whom you can have a conversation, to whom you can go for advice, with whom you can compare notes. It can be quite lonely being the compliance officer or the MLRO or an organization, and you're always fighting fights with different people, right? You're always having arguments with people, even in a good organization. And let me be clear, that healthy balance of debate between business and compliance is important, and it's actually unhealthy for an organization if compliance gets its way each and every time. There needs to be adherence to the rules, but there also needs to be a healthy dialogue between business and control functions. But I think it's very healthy for compliance people and the general well-being to be surrounded by and to have access to a community of fellow compliance experts with whom they can actually discuss and debate. And there are fora for that in the jurisdiction which people should seek out. So I think that's all very positive.
Fantastic. And looking a bit into the future, Charles, and how do you see the future of the MLRO officer in a business?
Okay, so as we were saying earlier, I think it's going to be, number one, professionalized and strengthened, or as it ought to be. I think one thing which we're going to start seeing is what I would call narrowing or restriction. So I think that we're going to stop seeing the phenomenon of the individual who holds 20 different MLRO positions. I think there will still be a market, and there will still be consultants who are sought out from time to time, for example, to hold MLRO positions on an interim basis, or who would quite manageably and proportionately hold a restricted number of such positions. But I think we're going to move to a world where if you are an MLRO, you're an MLRO for a limited group of entities, simply because it's very difficult to credibly deliver on the various things that need to be delivered if you are sitting on various organizations. And I think that's rightly so. That's the direction which the regulators are nudging the industry towards. I think we'll start seeing MLROs who are more senior and who are, let's say, strategically robustly placed within organizations. And I think those same MLROs are going to become a lot more assertive, because if you are aware that you can be held personally responsible, right? I think you're going to have a stronger motivation to be more assertive. So I think we are going to start seeing more motivated and more assertive MLRO persons. In addition to that, hopefully we will find that the MLROs find that that other members of senior management and members of boards have, let's say, more of an open mind to compliance-related matters. I think we've already started to see this culture change in the country, right? So I think that the latest developments in terms of personal responsibility will drive boards in general in that direction. As a side note, I think MLROs are probably going to become more expensive because people are going to they're going to be probably fewer MLROs to go around, and MLROs are going to expect some form of cover for the increasing levels of personal responsibility which they are going to be expected to take on. So I think generally we're going to see an increase in the importance of the MLRO function, and they would encourage MLROs to actually appreciate the breadth and the scope and the depth of obligations which they are faced, to appreciate the risk and to contribute in an assertive and persuasive way in the decision making of the companies to which they offer their services.
I completely agree with all the points, Charles, especially on the MLRO's increased responsibility, which will lead to more interaction, more scrutiny, and more communication with the board and C-level suite, especially when it comes to the implementation and the compliance procedures, both internal and external, from the client perspective, which will also lead, as you said, to an increase perhaps in financial remuneration. But this can take many forms. It can be, in the form of personal liability insurance, for example, or it can be in the form of increased benefits. But one point that I strongly agree with, and I'm super glad that we are heading in that direction, is a limitation to the number of appointments one person can hold in different entities, because at the moment it's quite, I think that, again, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think there's any particular restrictions
there's no hard restriction, and the hard restriction is not being introduced, let's be clear. But I think what's going to happen is that, in light of the personal responsibilities and also in light of long-standing drives on the part of regulators to ensure that MLROs can dedicate appropriate time to the organizations that they are dealing with, I think we're going to see some level of divestment. So I think that there are probably a few people who hold a dozen or more of these appointments, and I think some of those people are going to see that is no longer sustainable or even desirable from their perspective, and we're going to see either outright the employment of full-time MLROs, which is already quite normal in larger organizations. Of course, that's probably not necessary for the smaller organizations, so I wouldn't expect every organization to have a full-time MLRO, and that would mean that there are certain people who are probably holding a handful of these positions, and if done properly, that can be perfectly sustainable. But I do think we're going to see narrowing in the number of MLRO positions that any one particular MLRO holds.
Excellent, and I agree with that, and hopefully it's something that will catch up sooner rather than later, in order to give professionals that breathing space, but also companies that particular focus and care that they need in order to navigate through all of this.
Correct. Agreed.
We are reaching slowly the end of this broadcast, sadly. So, because I think we can probably spend hours and hours, talking about, the future, talking about changes and everything. So, if anyone in our audience has any questions, I would encourage you to type them in now, because we're close to the end. I think we're just 2 minutes towards the end, so any questions, please do type in the comments. However, if you prefer to keep those anonymous, or you would prefer to have more in-depth advice on these issues, you can contact Charles Cassor on charles.cassor@shoulder.mt. It's also rolling on the screen if you want to take a screenshot of that, so you can reach out to Charles directly. Charles, I'm very, very grateful you spent this time with us today, shared some fantastic insights and knowledge, and I've picked up some things that I didn't know. Hopefully the audience did the same, and really, really, really thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Fran, for organizing this, and it's been a real pleasure speaking with you, as always, honestly.
Likewise, likewise, and I'm sure we'll have more to come as new developments are happening. We've got a very positive comment from Franco Farrugia. Thank you very much, very informative. Thank you for joining us, Franco, and I hope the others tuning in found it and are in sentiment with Franco and ourselves. We are now at the end. Charles, thank you again.
Thank you
for your time and insights. Thank you everyone for joining us. The recorded session will be made available within the next 24 hours as well. Everyone have a good day. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.